Welcome to another week of the Public Interest Technology Colloquium, Cybernetics and Artificial Intelligence, History and Social Issues. My name is Katina Michael, and I'm a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, and I also direct the Society Policy Engineering Collective at Arizona State University. And today it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Professor Ronald Kline of Cornell University. Ron has an amazing career. He started out at General Electric as an electrical engineer, having completed studies at Kansas State University. He then moved on into the field of history, but not before a small stint in computer science. And ever since then, his career has taken an amazing turn because of his passion for history. At Cornell, he was able to use that history of technology in an engineering school where he was able to come together with so many diverse students from various disciplines and teach them about the history of technology. He was the editor-in-chief of the IEEE Technology and Society magazine between 1995 and 1997. He also was president of the IEEE Society on the Social Implications of Technology, and he has contributed much to the history of IEEE and technology within the History Center at IEEE, both as a volunteer and as a full-time staffer at different times. He has an oral history online, which I encourage all of you to go and view. It's there, and it's a fascinating intrigue into his life and his works, and also his preoccupations. He mentions so many varied people that have influenced him and impacted his life, and also about his non-traditional journey towards Cornell University. At the time he was at General Electric, he was working on submarines, and his collision course with live artillery in Scotland, I believe, perhaps influenced his about turn towards the study of history of technology, in some ways reminiscent of the great Norbert Wiener, whom we will touch on today, I'm sure, through the talk on cybernetics and artificial intelligence. In this interview, Ron mentions a dear friend of ours, Terry Bookman, the former managing editor of the IEEE Technology and Society magazine, who's also here with us today, who worked with us on many decades of volumes of the magazine, which I encourage many of you to submit your work to. As director of the Center of the History of Electrical Engineering at IEEE, that's a whole different gambit of archiving, and I guess where Ron was able to really demonstrate his historical evidence-based practice. Here's a blast from the past, Ron Kline, a picture from Carl de Stefan's great article on the history of IEEE SSIT. On the left there, some of the older minutes that we can see from one of our ADCOM meetings, 1991. It feels like a long time ago, but I'm sure life has sort of flashed by given the contributions you've made. Here, a letter that was documented in those minutes from the Wall Street Journal as you replied to a very interesting post, an advertisement that IEEE had demonstrated an effect on Operation Desert Storm. And you wrote back with Engineer of Death, or Winning the Technology, and Winning with Technology was the title of that IEEE advertisement. You've served on the advisory board since I can remember. As a young 30-year-old, I think I was first introduced to you through this board and learned much just from watching you, Ron, but little did I understand that one day I would be employed in a role where many of the people you have worked with and touched the lives of would be working with me. So a privilege on my part to know you. Some of your works, we can look at technology and culture, the ISIS outlet, a lot of in social values, and so much on the history, IEEE Spectrum, the list goes on and on. I encourage people to have a look at your Google Scholars. If they're interested in this field and are looking for journals to publish in, you've probably published in most of the good ones, Ron. One that stuck out to me was this article in the IEEE, Explore Corpus, Engineering Case Studies, Bridging Micro and Macro Ethics. So many books that have touched your hands and you've produced and written. This one on Steinmetz, Engineering and Socialist. this one on consumers in the country, technology and social change in rural America, and then the fortune of me meeting you from afar in 2014. There were so many who wanted to talk to you after your panel, but here was the first meeting at Norbert Wiener. We've now had 3 biennial events on Norbert Wiener, and there's a whole resource center that's being continuously updated with information and with material. The book that really started to get me to navigate towards your work was this one, The Cybernetics Moment, or what we call our age, the information age. And I believe you'll be talking a lot about this today. And perhaps a pinnacle in my personal career was getting to co-author with you some years ago now on Wiener's cybernetics legacy and the growing need for the interdisciplinary approach. And that's what we do at ASU. That's what we do at SFIS. Our guest host today, and that's a bit of a surprise, Ron Kline, is Jameson Wetmore. And as many of us who work with Jamie and love Jamie so much, given his contributions, and very much never really speaks about his contributions, but I thought I'd spare a moment to talk about them today. He'll always deflect the light to others, in this case, the koala. Yes, the koala is an Australian citizen residing in Australia when Jamie was visiting here once upon a time, but his contribution has been stellar. A lot of work done early on in nanotechnology, several NSF grants, if not many more, but this one caught my attention. But he's always been there supporting people around him. This one where he's considered the nano guy, or at least another nano guy, and so much more, now the new tech humanist. His voice is just as crucial in Technology and Society, an MIT Press book that's now in its 2nd edition. And MIT Press are not known for textbooks that much, but Jamie and Professor Deborah Johnson have really made their mark with this particular text, which is being used in so many universities. Other books from Springer on nanotechnology and the challenges of equity, equality, and development, and a yearbook of nanotechnology and society, and so much more. Even a trip to Antarctica a few years ago, Ron Kline, that we're all jealous about. But look, students on the most amazing study abroad. And so today, 2 of my friends, Ron Kline, the floor is yours, but first to give the floor to Jameson Wetmore, and I'll stop sharing. Welcome, Jamie.
I didn't know I was going to be embarrassed here. I thought my job was just to embarrass Ron. All right, I'm gonna try not to take up too much time, but I do want to say a couple of quick things. So thank you, Katina, for offering all of the amazing accomplishments that Ron has had over his career. I think it's really, I'm very, very pleased that you looked well beyond simply his academic accomplishments, but I want to speak a little bit more to those as well. So I just did the math, and it was just over 26 years ago, or just less than 26 years ago, on a very, very cold day in December in Cornell, where Ron sort of looked at me and he goes, I think I might be able to work with you. And that was perhaps one of the most fateful days of my life, because that has absolutely led me on the track that I'm on. So I am a little bit biased in saying that I'm incredibly pleased that I got to be both a research assistant and a TA, and have Ron as the chair of my committee. And all the things that you have just shown of my work, Katina, are clearly a result of work that I started early on, and that Ron introduced me to. The 2 Tech and Society books at MIT Press are very clearly in my head direct lineage from work that I did with Ron as an RA back in the day. And I will say that as I am biased, but I'm not the only one. I don't know what the current status is, but I certainly know when I was a graduate student at Cornell, when you would talk to other people, you'd say, who's on your committee? Everybody would always say Ron Kline. And you'd sort of look, Ron's on your committee too? And like, of course, why wouldn't you have Ron on your committee? So we were all incredibly big fans back in the day, and I'm very excited that he's continuing to do this amazing work, and very, very proud that he has retired as well. So, but of course, retired officially, but I suspect he's still doing a fair amount of work, and we get to benefit from that with his talk right now. So thank you, Ron, for everything, and I look forward to your talk.
Beautiful.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for this very generous introductions. And it's such a great thing that both Katina and Jamie are at ASU, and they work together and they know each other. And inviting me to do this. So what I'm going to do today for the next 45 minutes or so is to talk about a new project of mine, and it's a way to write the history of artificial intelligence. Most of the histories of artificial intelligence are written by the practitioners, but there's a great young collection of scholars, postdocs, graduate students, and young professors that are beginning to write this history too. So I'm going to take a little different tack in this, and I want to tie this first foray, and again, this is what this is, to tie it to cybernetics. So what I want to do today, I want to do something fairly simple. I want to critique the view that's common in the historiographic literature that cybernetics was merely the origin point of AI. And after that, it's not much of importance. And at the end, I'll suggest how cybernetics itself can critique AI. So I want to do both of those things, to do history and also do a little bit of using Norbert Wiener's ideas about critiquing your own discipline. Okay. So this idea that cybernetics is the origin point of AI. So what I mean by artificial intelligence is what occurred after World War II with the invention of the electronic computer. And when the field, researchers started to call that field artificial intelligence. There were automata, there have been automata for generations and generations, for more than a couple hundred years. So what they thought was new was this. This is a quote from Marvin Minsky, one of the founders of artificial intelligence. He said the electronic digital computer made it practical to be much more ambitious than building automata. And here he's referring to cybernetic automata, mechanical mice and tortoises. As a result, Minsky says, cybernetics divided, in my view, into three chief avenues: self-organizing systems, which includes neural nets; simulation of human thought, which is the work of Herbert Simon and Alan Newell; and artificial intelligence. And you notice there, Minsky separates his own work and that of McCarthy, artificial intelligence, from the work of Alan Newell and Herbert Simon. Together today, so his main point is that cybernetics was a starting point, but then it divides. And for him, the key system is artificial intelligence, not these other two. In 1983, Alan Newell, another founder of artificial intelligence at Carnegie Mellon, wrote a very influential article on the history of AI. And he dates it back even further. He dates it back to this issue. He talks about several issues in the history of artificial intelligence. The first one, the very first one, mechanism versus teleology. So what does he mean there? Basic question is this: do mechanisms have purpose? Can they have purpose? And that debate, he dates to 1640, and he argues that it was settled 300 years later with cybernetics, and specifically with a paper by Norbert Wiener and two co-authors in 1943 to show that machines can have purpose. Okay, so there, cybernetics is definitely the origin point of making artificial intelligence possible. But then he talks about a split. From 1955 onward, debating these issues split AI from cybernetics. So the first is symbolic versus continuous system. This is the language of 1983. Symbolic is symbolic AI, to use computer programs to model human thought in a logical way usually, or so forth. Continuous systems are usually analog systems. And the early cybernetic systems were usually analog, but they can also be neural nets, which is the big news today, of course. That split AI from cybernetics. And secondly, the issue of psychology versus neurophysiology. And here we get at the interdisciplinary part that Professor Michael mentioned: psychology versus neurophysiology. Newell and Herbert Simon drew on psychology, not neurophysiology. Cybernetics always drew on neurophysiology. So I would say that this is one of the origin points of this idea that cybernetics is the origin point of AI. So this is what I'm going to critique. You can find it in most everyone who writes on cybernetics. There are a few exceptions, of course. Okay, so what do I mean by cybernetics? So I've written a book that argues that it's not a unified discipline, that people meant a lot of things by cybernetics. But today, I'm going to use basically Norbert Wiener's highly influential definition of cybernetics and from his book, where he gave this, as Katina said, where he gave this field its name. Two very influential books, Cybernetics and the Human Use of Human Beings. I still assign the human use of human beings to my students. And they read it and they go, this book was written in the 1950s. They can't believe this book was written in the 1950s because it speaks to them today. The subtitle of Wiener's book is what's key here: control and communication in the animal and the machine. So the basic tenets, I would say, of Wiener's view of cybernetics is this: the purposeful behavior of both animals and machines can be explained by their internal self-regulating systems. In other words, analogy. You can study humans and machines by using the same system. You can see that in the subtitle of Wiener's book: control and communication in the animal and the machine. Now, what are these self-regulating systems? They receive information feedback about the environment from sensors. They act on the environment via effectors to achieve the entity's goals. Here's where teleology comes into play. The mechanism can have purpose. And if it can have purpose, it can be intelligent. The scope of cybernetics, and this is debated a lot, but the scope of cybernetics for Wiener was wide. And for a lot of cyberneticians from the 50s and 60s and 70s, very wide. From the level of the cell to society in living organisms, and from the simple household thermostat to autonomous robots in intelligent machines. And in fact, one of the definitions of cybernetics at the time is the science of robots. So think about the household thermostat. They're very simple, right? It has sensors. It senses the temperature of a room, say. And it has a setting. Somebody said, well, I want the room to be 68 degrees. And then it gets some feedback. He gets some feedback from the room through these sensors. What's the temperature? Is it higher or lower? If it's lower, it sends a signal. This is where the effector part comes in. It sends a signal to the furnace to come on and to heat up the room. If it's colder, if it's higher than 68, it'll send a signal to an air conditioner to cool down the room. So this is control engineering. It predated Wiener by a lot, but by 20 years at least, by 20 years. What's new with Wiener is to say that these processes apply to all living organisms and to all intelligent machines. There were some other precedences. So what does this have to do with AI? Well, it has to do with AI basically because here is the way artificial intelligence is seen by this point of view is the way it can act on the environment and to have purpose, to have a purpose. So these ideas were developed by an extraordinary set of conferences that lasted from 1946 to 1953, informally known as the Macy Conferences on Cybernetics. Wiener published his book in 48, they take that name. Its formal title was Conferences on Feedback Mechanisms and Circular Causality. You can view that thermostat or like regulator on a steam engine as a circular form of causality. And here's the key point, biology and the social sciences. So it's interdisciplinary from the very beginning, a lot to do with Wiener experience at Harvard. So this photo is a group photo taken in the last conference, 1953. It shows in the front row are the two chief organizers of the conference, Warren McCulloch, who's a neurophysiologist, and Margaret Mead, who's an anthropologist. She's probably the most famous scientist in that room. There are also mathematicians. There's Claude Shannon, founder of information theory. The physicist, Heinz von Forster, founder of the Biological Laboratory, University of Illinois. Engineers, Julian Bigelow, who worked with von Neumann on early computer. Biologists, and Casper, neuroscientists, McCulloch and others, anthropologists. Besides Margaret Mead, there's her husband, by then former husband, Gregory Bateson, is known for second order cybernetics. Psychologists, linguists, philosophers. One of the philosophers is Joshua Bar Hillel, who had some commentary on the difficulties with machine translation of language, which are still applicable today. So this group started out focusing on this analogy between feedback systems and humans, electronic computer, was seen as electronic brain, so forth. And they debated several issues. In my book, I talk about three main issues: analogies and models, information theory, which is coming to the fore at the same time, 1948, and the problems of interdisciplinarity. So let me just say one thing about one of these debates about analog digital. There's a really intriguing conversation debate there, whether the brain is analog or digital. These terms are new at the time as applied to computers and applied to systems. Whether it's analog, meaning continuous signals, or digital, meaning discrete. And there's a huge debate between John von Neumann, computer scientist, between Licklider, who's one of the founders of the internet later, neurophysiologists who do research on the brain, and anthropologists. And they had this gigantic debate, and they can't decide whether the brain is analog or digital. And then Bateson says, these terms, wait a minute, these terms don't seem right to me. I don't understand these new terms. An analog is just that, it's an analog. It's just a model of something. That can be either continuous or discrete. In other words, it can be analog or digital. And then they have a debate again, and they said, they finally realized that these terms are not opposites of each other. They're not logical opposites of each other, analog and digital. And Licklider says, throws up his hands in confusion, and he says, why don't we change these terms? This is 1950. He said, why don't we change these terms? And somebody replied back, look, we've been using these for 5 years. We get along fine with these terms. And he says, okay, we'll use these terms as best we can. And here we are 70 years later. Okay. This debate will come up later in the talk. Okay. So most of these folks were not building machines. That was not their intention. They're not building robots. Even this early cybernetic mechanisms, which are displayed at the conference or talked about at the conference, they're not considered to be robots. And here are the four of the famous ones. Norbert Wiener's own moth bedbug that was built in his laboratory around 1950. Shannon's Theseus, which is a mechanical mouse that would go in a maze, bump its way around the room, and then once it learned its path, you could put it in again and would be able to go to its goal. The English cyberneticians Ross Aspey's homeostat, which showed that, or he argued, which showed that a random selection will self-organize itself into and adapt to its environment. And Gray Walter's tortoises. Both Wiener's and Gray Walter's tortoises have photocells in them, so they're attracted to light or they're repelled from light. That's why Wiener calls it the moth bedbug. Gray Walter's has lights on them and so forth. So they make their way around the room. They're attracted to light. They make their way over to recharge their batteries. This is 1950, 1951. What are they doing? They're not trying to build robots. Wiener is trying to simulate Parkinsonian tremors. He's funded by Life magazine. He's also funded by the military. And that system has two feedback circuits in it for an intention tremor and a purpose tremor. A purpose tremor and a regular tremor. So here to me is the heart of cybernetics. That what you see in human bodies, Parkinsonian tremors, you can make a model of that in the machine tremors, and you will learn more. You will learn about each other. You will learn by making that model. You will learn more about the human system, And by doing the human system, you will learn how to make intelligent machines. Same way with Shannon's. Shannon's mouse, the thing there was how do entities learn. So this entity learned, it's a bunch of relays. It's not even transistors or electronics. So this were these early cybernetic mechanisms. So when people are saying that cybernetics is the origin of AI, this is what they're referring to as much as anything else, is these mechanisms. Okay. So typically, especially in the United States, the beginning of artificial intelligence was a summer research project on artificial intelligence that I and other people have written a lot about, that occurred at Dartmouth in 1956. It was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Here's a photo of some of the founders. They're all white men. And there's Claude Shannon on the right, who's not talking about his mouse. He's talking about brain modeling. Above his shoulders, John McCarthy, who's going to be one of the founders of AI at MIT. Marvin Minsky is next to him in the back row. Nathan Rochester, who's at IBM, who's actually working on neural nets. He's using digital computers to simulate neural nets. Oliver Selfridge at MIT Lincoln Labs. Ray Solomonoff, who's celebrated today for machine learning, right? But at the time, he was seen as kind of an oddball, brilliant kind of oddball character. And it's people who are not in the photo that were there for the whole time are Alan Newell and Herbert Simon. So at this conference, and also at the follow-up huge conference in England, shown by the proceedings on the right, there are two basic approaches. Brain model, and I'm using the terms of the actors themselves. Brain modeling, in other words, if we can model the human brain, say with neural nets or simulations of neural nets, what kind of intelligence do we get from that? Or, this is Alan Newell and Herbert Simon's approach, adopted by McCarthy, and McCarthy's approach adopted by Minsky, to use a computer not only as a metaphor for mind, but the computer program as a mind itself, right? So logical functions and just search for things, understand language and so forth. So this is where cybernetics is, the beginnings of AI. Now it's interesting, a lot of these folks do both at the time. Shannon wrote a famous paper on how to program the computer to play chess. He built a cybernetic mechanism, and he does a brain model. So a lot of people do both. So this is how fluid it is in the late 1950s, early 1960s. At the Mechanician Thought Conference, there's Frank Rosenblatt with neural nets. There's Grace Hopper on programming computers automatically. There's Warren McCulloch. So cybernetic, it's all one kind of mixture there. They haven't separated themselves out yet. So let me talk about a little bit about cybernetics spawning the neural net approach. Just going to say I'm just going to give two examples. One is the famous papers, one of the founding papers of cybernetics. This is by Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts, 1943. It's a mathematical paper, and they argued mathematically that a neural network with logical connections and with a ideal kind of neuron, which came to be called McCulloch-Pitts neuron, could do computation. And that's one of the founding papers of cybernetics, along with the teleology paper. So there's a lot of work done on neural nets after that. The other approach, sometimes people conflate these, as one to do today, so the actors view these as very separate. Another kind of approach is Frank Rosenblatt's perceptron. And this is a way to use for pattern recognition, to use a model of the brain in which you have artificial neurons, and you have those artificial neurons in a random order, and they self-organize. This is what Minsky meant and other people meant, self-organizing systems. The key is the neurons have weights on them. So you set up this machine, you train it. People who know something today about machine learning, deep learning, will recognize all of this because it's where it came from. Present an image to the retina. These are photocells again. You get signals, and this is propagated forward, and you get a response. And then you compare that response through what's even then called supervised learning. You compare that response, and you adjust the weights of the inputs to the neurons to get the right response. Okay. So this work started in the late 50s. Rosenblatt is at that Teddington conference. Right away, people began cutting out cybernetics. They began making a division between symbolic AI and they labeled it cybernetics. So for example, this famous, probably the first anthology, definitely in English, of artificial intelligence, computers and thought, 1963, it excluded this approach. And they said why? They called it neural cybernetics, which I think is telling. Neural cybernetics. Progress today, neural cybernetics is barely discernible, excluded. Rosenblatt he's more interested in the hybrid approaches. If he's going to talk about symbolic AI, he's going to try to include it with his neural nets. But he's more interested in how to do brain modeling. And he draws a distinction between these two approaches. One is very much based on logic and symbolic logic. The other is based on psychology and neurophysiology. And he argued for the advantages of the later. Okay, let me say a little bit more about Rosenblatt. He was at Cornell. He was at the Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory, funded by the Office of Naval Research. He built a machine, but he also did computer simulation. This is a publicity photo and so forth. There's a huge debate. There's some very good articles in the 90s about this neural net debate and the perceptron controversy. Here's the machine. You can see I don't know if that's a Cornell student or not, but there's a big C for Cornell. As a pattern recognition. And again, these neurons, there's potentiometers. There are potentiometers, adjust the weights that run by electric motors. There are photocells, there are electronic circuits. It's definitely an analog system, even though the neurons produce a 1 or a 0 output. They do computer simulation too. And this is a quote from Bloch, who's a mathematician that worked for Rosenblatt. And he said, the machine is faster than the digital computer, has an enormous advantage in speed over the digital computer, since essentially all the action goes on in a parallel simultaneously. Think back to that network. Everything is going at once. And the response appears almost immediately. You get an input, you get a response like that. While in the digital simulation, all computations are done in sequence. And again, this is a time when digital computers are expensive. They used an IBM 704. This was the standard debate in another area of analog digital computers. Analog computers were faster at the time until the 1970s or so. Okay. Now, there's been a lot written about this, about how the Pentagon's Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, which is known as DARPA in the 1970s, it funds symbolic AI. In other words, the approach of Herbert Simon, Alan Newell, John McCarthy, and the later Minsky over neural nets. The neural net funding drops, which is true, but it doesn't disappear. Margaret Bowden, who's a cognitive scientist and has written an amazing 2-volume, 1,300 pages worth on the history of cognitive science, is really good on all of this. So ARPA funded all these centers. I'm going to focus on the last one, which is the Stanford Research Institute, because it started out with neural nets and it ended up with symbolic AI robots. How did it start out with neural nets, perceptrons? It hired Frank Rosenblatt as a consultant. And so they developed a neural net. Then they switched to, when they switched to symbolic AI, then they started getting funding from ARPA. Before that, they did not get funding from ARPA. They got funding from other agencies, but not from ARPA. And when they switched to a symbolic AI program, they hired another consultant, not Frank Rosenblatt, who died tragically in 1969, but a student of Marvin Minsky. You can see him in the picture here. It's Bertrand Raphael. So here's Shaky. It's a famous robot. There's a Robots Hall of Fame. It's one of the robots in the Robots Hall of Fame. These are pictures from the Computer History Museum. One of our former students, Hanson Su, is a curator at that museum. If you read this little book by Rodney Brooks called Flesh and Machines, he gives an interesting description of Shaky. So Shaky is a robot here. It has a radio link. What's the radio link for? Because the computer is not, main computer is not on board. The main computer is a PDP-10 that Helen Chan is operating there. It has a camera. It has a laser rangefinder. So its goal is to move around the room, find its way around the room to move blocks and so forth. So Rodney Brooks gives a good description of this and the similar kinds of robots at Stanford. They move, the computer knows where it is because how far the wheels move. They move, then they stop and wait for calculations to occur. And then they move again and stop and wait for calculations to occur. Okay. So this group, and I want to do more research on this. I had not, because of COVID, I have not done much archival research. But Nils Nilsson, who wrote a good practitioner history of AI, he gives a good account of this from his point of view, because he was a project leader on it. And he says he was inspired by two ideas. He doesn't call these cybernetic ideas, but homeostasis and from biology, and this TOTE unit from cognitive psychology. The TOTE unit is test, operate, test, exit. It's from the famous book in cognitive psychology that was inspired by cybernetics. So here's an approach in symbolic AI that's inspired by cybernetics. So I show this because it's I think, too simple to equate cybernetics with the older mechanisms and also with neural nets only. So here's an approach. Here's a cybernetic approach. I mean, there's two basic ideas that are inspired by cybernetics. Well, one inspires cybernetics, and one is inspired by cybernetics, cognitive psychology. So there's a lot of good research on this debate about neural nets and the falling of resources, and then it's rediscovered in the 1980s. When I came to Cornell in 1987, this was big news. This was gigantic news that neural nets are back. You know, we can do computer simulation, and they attribute it to this research group at the University of California, San Diego. And I put this group up because, to me, the way they're inspired by cybernetics, so without doing more research into the archives of this, is through their interdisciplinary approach. Instead of using the term cybernetics, they use the term cognitive science. So the work has been interdisciplinary and represents what we consider a true cognitive science approach. By this time, in the 70s, I argue in my book, cybernetics status as a science has fallen into disfavor in the US. People don't want to be associated with the term cybernetics. That may be part of it too, I just don't want it. So the group include, this may sound familiar, think of the Macy Conferences, psychologists, physicists, mathematicians, neuroscientists, biologists, computer scientists, headed by cognitive psychologists. And they came up with an algorithm, backpropagation. Well, they actually reinvented it, and which made perceptron type of neural nets very practical. Okay. So what I'm doing here in this latter history is just giving instances where I can see that cybernetics is directly involved with AI. And my argument is, it's not just something that was the cybernetic mechanisms, or it showed that teleological mechanisms are possible, but people are drawing on it throughout the history of AI. So that's my main argument. So one of the well-known one of these is how the people who developed what came to be called sociable robots at MIT, at the AI lab founded by McCarthy and Minsky, turn to cybernetics. They turn away from trying to do what was going on with Shaky. In Shaky, reason the computations take so long, there's a representation of the environment in the computer. Every time the robot moves, it's checked against that representation of the environment. Rodney Brooks had read as a young, like a young adult student, Gray Walter's book on the tortoises. And he looks at the Stanford cart and he knows about Shaky and he goes, these things stop and go, whereas Gray Walter's tortoises are exploring the room, they're embodied in their environment. They don't have a map of the room in their head. Their map is the room itself. Right, their map is the room itself. They get the information about their environment from exploring that environment. And to me, one of the most interesting, Brooks did a lot of work on insects, and one of his most interesting work was by a PhD student of his, Cynthia Brazel, who developed Kismet. In fact, Brooks highly praises her and her book on designing sociable robots. So this idea that you're not having in the computer a simulation of the outside world is in the with this. What makes this a sociable robot? Well, they studied a lot of way people's eyes move when you talk. Now, I cannot have eye contact with anyone on the screen. Right? Well, sort of, I can kind of see a little bit, but people require a lot to interact with each other, eye contact. First of all, there are 15 computers running this little head, right? And all of this stuff, so I was going to show a video of this. If you go online, you'll see a video. If you interact with this Kismet, it will follow you. It will follow you. You say, well, what do you think of my watch? And it will look down at your watch and then it will talk. It doesn't understand anything. I mean, it doesn't understand. It has its ability to communicate at the time around 2000, which is really important. But it is a sociable robot, and that's a whole new realm of that. In fact, there is a new part of artificial intelligence that was called A-Life, artificial life at the time, in the late 1990s. Anyone who's read Kathleen Hale's book on cybernetics will see that as a form of cybernetics. And it was seen as this new cybernetics. So outsiders are calling this the new cybernetics. Brooks himself gives direct lineage to Gray Walter. Okay, so how about today? How about today? Okay. And again, this is based on just observation on my part. There's not much. I don't have access to inside. Well, I have a little access inside Google or to Amazon or to Apple. So we think of today's highly visible AI projects. So what's AI known for today? It's known for machine learning and deep learning, but the ones you see, right? The ones you see are these digital assistants, Siri, Alexa, Google Assistant. Neural nets have made them, like Google Translation, a lot better. And also driverless cars, which reminds me when Jamie was a PhD student, one of the options for a PhD dissertation was on driverless cars at the time. So what are these? Okay, I don't know if these folks are, this is to me a different aspect where cybernetics is involved with the history of AI. Everything I've said up to this point has been where I've tried to take a research situation that's well known and see where cybernetics is, where people are directly using cyber and they're even calling it cybernetics. This is different because, well, first of all, I haven't gone inside these places yet. But from my observer's point of view, these are cybernetics projects. It's clear. It's AI combined with an information feedback control system, right? Siri, you ask Siri, Alexa to do something, it does it. It gets a look, it goes online, it does it, turns on your turns on your radio, gives you music. It can turn on things in your house, so forth and so on. It's this feedback control system with AI, right? What's a driverless car? If anything else, it's a feedback control system connected to AI. And in fact, the early research in driverless cars is from a DARPA project. It's from those DARPA challenge matches, right, over a period of time. So to me, they are definitely that. One reason I think that's important is if you're going to critique and understand these projects, it's good to know what kind of assumptions, scientific and technological and views of the world assumptions are built into these from cybernetics and information feedback control. Now contrast that with AlphaGo. So AlphaGo is a Google bought this. It's a deep mind project for a computer to play the ancient Chinese game of Go. And this is a famous challenge max in 2016. We have a graduate student at Cornell, John, whose dissertation is on AlphaGo. In 2016, Lee Sedol, which is a former world champion in Go, was beaten handily by AlphaGo. And if you watch this documentary, it's remarkable. If you watch the documentary, the way they trained AlphaGo too was to bring in a Go player to see where the weaknesses in the system were. They had to play millions of games against itself or against other players. But one of the keys to that was bringing in that Go expert. But if I think about this as a cybernetic project, think about this, right? It doesn't speak. It doesn't move. Here it's playing a board game. It's not moving the stones. A human is moving the stones. So why is that? Here's my guess. If you read Nathan Inzman's really good article on this chess of Drosophila of AI, you'll see that there are all these conventions around chess. Well, there's all these conventions, even more so because it's an older game, around Go. I would imagine that they did not want to, they wanted to focus on the AlphaGo as a system, and they didn't want to have it mechanically moving the stone. I wonder even if that would have been accepted in the challenge match. So one of the team managers, maybe the team manager, is moving the stones. On the screen is AlphaGo algorithm itself telling it where to put, and it beat, and it beat it in a surprising way. So to me, this seems different, but of course there's feedback systems there. Okay. Let's see, what time is it? 12:20. About 10 minutes or so? Okay. Let me turn to this larger issue because we're dealing a lot with Norbert Wiener today. I think you cannot ignore how this all relates, even the history of it, how it all relates to present day past social consequences or implications or co-constructed consequences and future ones. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 4 of these books that deal with this. Let me start with Wiener's book himself, God and Golem, 1964. So in The Human Use of Human Beings, which he wrote in the 50s, and in God and Golem, Wiener, as Katina pointed out in her introduction, definitely is concerned with the social aspects of this, the very science that he invented, cybernetics. Very concerned about that. And there's various ways to deal with that. In God and Golem, he tells a parable, an old parable, called The Monkey's Paw. This is one of those stories that's like common with The Sorcerer's Apprentice. It's about the dangers of literal mindedness, of a machine, of magic, especially being literal minded. So the story, the way Wiener tells it, is, first of all, it's a 1915 story by an English writer. And it's got colonial implications throughout. A family is sitting down to dinner. There's a son for dinner, and there's a old friend from who'd just been to India. And the guy who'd just been to India had a monkey paw, and a dried monkey paw was supposed to be magic. And it would give 3 wishes to 3 successive owners. He's the second owner. The first owner's third wish was to die. And during dinner, he's telling the story, and the son goes off to work in the factory. So the sergeant from India, who had served in India, so he's the second owner, and he's ready to throw this monkey paw into the fire. So the host grabs the monkey paw and right away wishes for 200 pounds. English money, 200 pounds. Right away, there's a knock at the door. And at the door is someone from the factory to tell them that unfortunately their son has died in a factory accident. We're very sorry your son has died in this accident, and here's 200 pounds as our consolation. So they're all grieved about this. Oh my God, this monkey's coming to it. Then, according to the story, the mother takes the paw and makes another wish. She asks for her son back. There's another knock at the door. What's the next knock at the door? It's their son is a ghost. So their third wish, right, is just to be rid of all of this. So Wiener tells a story as a parable about automation, about computer automation, the literal mindedness of computers. He's not talking about algorithms or machine learning, but he does say that in automation in 1964, the literalness of the computer programs is a danger, especially if they're learning programs. Okay, so almost 50 years later, I'm going to look at 3 other books. And these first 2, again, talk about the dangers of literal-minded algorithms, right? So this is a great book by Meredith Broussard on artificial intelligence, I think, because she's designed artificial systems. She's been on DARPA challenge grants and so forth. One of my favorite examples of these, the literal mindedness comes symbolized on the cover by a rag over the robot's face, actually, because it's not really viewing its own world. All right. Okay. The example comes to mind is for driverless cars. She says, okay, we're working on this system and we're having problems with traffic cones. And the problems we're having with traffic cones, we've told, we programmed into the computer. And again, there's a map of the world of the environment into the computer. We told the computer system to avoid traffic cones. You know, we told them what traffic cone is, that they're orange, what their shapes are, they can recognize this. But we didn't tell them to avoid traffic cones that were knocked over. So we had to go back in, change the program to program them for cones that were knocked over. That's how literal minded, that's the literal mindedness of it, I would say. The second book is this great book by Ruha Benjamin, sociologist at Princeton. I commented on her talk at the history of AI summer school this past summer. This is a great book about the new Jim Code, how algorithms have racial bias built into them because they're programmed basically by folks who have that kind of bias. One of the examples she gave is not in that book, but in the article published in 2019 is a very straightforward example, easy to understand. This is an algorithm used to decide who gets into a healthcare management program. Okay. This is developed by this health company, and then outside public researchers looked at it, and they found that the algorithm would give more benefits to healthier white people than to more sicker Black people. So race is not part of this algorithm. Race is not a label on this algorithm. What was the label to stand in was the cost of their medical care cost. So people had the most medical care costs would be enrolled in this healthcare program. People who had the less medical care costs would not. So because of African Americans historically having less access to healthcare, their medical care costs would be lower. So it's a good example of this, what she calls the new Jim Crow. And again, I think it's a kind of literal mindedness. And my last example is this great book by Shoshana Zuboff called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I've assigned an article from this book. What she is arguing there is that the AI, and she uses a Marxist framework for this. So she uses phrases like forces of production, means of production, means of production, so forth. So what she's arguing is AI is the new means of production for surveillance capitalism. It's not that Google and other companies collect all this data. They take that data, use AI, and they have prediction products. And there's where the surplus value is. So from my point of view, and I give a very short description of all of that, you can use Wiener's approach to thinking about the technology that he himself created, especially about literal mindedness, to talk about social issues. Okay, so let me conclude. Okay. I'm interested in how cybernetics is included or cut out of the history of AI. And why do I think that matters? I think it matters because the researchers themselves have a view of the history of their field, and I think it matters. And I also think it matters to people who use it. So there's been an inclusionary kind of drawing boundaries. I use this term from Sociology of Science by Minsky, who said cybernetics divided into self-organizing systems, simulation, human thought, artificial intelligence. Of course, later, he writes the books that knocks down the first one, and also A-Life, to call it new cybernetics. But there's also exclusionary ones. I've talked about Feigenbaum and Feldman, excluding neurocybernetics. I talk about Newell, talking about what we're doing in AI keeps splitting AI from cybernetics. So I'm interested in this issue of the way they draw the boundaries. But let me end with a little more complicated, with a more interesting kind of statement. This is a statement from John McCarthy. He's one of the founders of AI. He's at the Dartmouth conference. He founds with Marvin Minsky, co-founds the AI laboratory at MIT, and then he goes to Stanford. He developed a Lisp, which is the main software program AI is written in. In fact, even from those sociable robots are written in a Lisp language. So he's writing a book review in 1988 on the sociology of AI. And he talks about his participation at Dartmouth, at the Dartmouth Summer School. And he says, as for myself, one of the reasons for inventing the term artificial intelligence, and people generally agree that he's the one who did that, was to escape association with cybernetics. This in 1956. Why? It's association with analog feedback. Analog feedback. All those early cybernetic mechanisms are analog feedback. Neural nets. It's basically a form of analog feedback. Even back propagation, right, is a form of analog feedback. And I wish to avoid having either to accept Norbert Wiener as a guru or having to argue with him. So I think I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. All right, we have a good, healthy amount of time for questions. If anybody wants to queue up, you're welcome to raise your hand or simply turn on your mic or throw it in the chat. Ron, I'll give you a second to get a drink of water. I have a number of questions, so I might just sort of prime the pump here. So my first one is, it's interesting, you focus a lot on some of the individual personalities involved, but then into your story is interwoven either who they work for or where their funding is coming from. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the different funding sources for these projects and what role that might have had in shaping directions, or as you said, sort of closed out with shaping exactly what these things are even called.
Sure. So the main funder for all of these is the military. Nothing but the military. Office of Naval Research, DARPA, the Army Signal Processing, Stanford's Research Institute is basically, it was split off from Stanford because of the protests in the 1960s against military funding being on campus. Minsky and Selfridge, when they first started out, they're at Lincoln Labs. What is Lincoln Labs? It's funded by the Air Force for continental radar system. So it's all funding by the military. So then the question is, historiographically, and I would say this applies to people thinking this who are not historians, right? Is how does this matter, right? So there's something called a Foreman thesis that for physics during the Cold War, that all this funding during the Cold War shifted the trajectory of physics. And lately, people who write on the history of the cold science, the sciences during the Cold War, argue against the Foreman thesis. Paul Edwards in the 1990s had talked about a phrase called mutual orientation. So it's not like this outside funder is shifting the trajectory to these researchers, who are just taking whatever money they can. So that was Edwards' idea. So this is something, you're right, that is definitely missing from my analysis right now, definitely so. I would love to get the Office of Naval Research papers, right? Because it funded Rosenblatt's issue, and it funded Heinz von Forster, the founder of Second Cybernetics. What they're mainly interested in, I can tell you what the funders are interested in the 50s and 60s. They're interested in pattern recognition. That's why they fund neural nets. They want to automate pattern recognition, whether it's translating articles from Russian, this is the Cold War, from Russia into English, mechanical translation language, whether they're trying to automate reading in optical character recognition, pattern recognition radar screens. They have very specific things. Okay, so that's their aim. And in fact, you'll see, if you think, I think Edwards' idea is a pretty good idea, actually, that it's a mutual orientation. This is before Sheila Jasanoff came up with the co-construction idea. They're doing this. So these projects, including Rosenblatt's, I didn't talk about, I can name a lot of them, Selfridge and idea about a system. They're all about pattern recognition. Then the driverless cars, what are they for? They're for driverless tanks, right? And in fact, last time I looked at Rodney Brooks' homepage, not homepage, but on Wikipedia, he was the main robot designer for the US military. So it's a big deal, right? The funding is from all of this. So the question would be, and I'm glad you raised it, how to understand this, right? How to understand this in regard to, I don't like the idea of moving it away from a natural trajectory, right? So one of the examples from the Cold War is, this relates to my earlier work before I became a pacifist, was oceanographers. What do they know the most about? They know mostly about the trenches under the ocean. Why do they know that? That's where submarines hide, right? So yeah, there's no question it shapes the knowledge that's produced, but to me, it's not the only story. So I like this mutual interaction. And there are some groups that are mediators. One of the most, it's hard to get access to some of this stuff, is JSTOR, the Joint Services Electronics Program. And they are mediators between the funders themselves and people, and so are the people. So yeah, it's a very good question. And in regard to cybernetics, I doubt, I'm not quite sure about that relationship. Cybernetics and information theory both have roots in the war, in World War II. Wiener publicly stops taking military funding in 1947. Shannon does not. In fact, Wiener criticizes Shannon for that. Wiener criticizes von Neumann for, he said, you could, in fact, in God and Golem, in that passage on, because the book's back, that passage on the monkey's paw, it's followed by his criticism of game theory, which was used by the military. So yeah, it's a big question, and it definitely should be part of the project going forward.
We got another question, but can I ask just one real quick follow-up on that? Your last examples of sort of talking about ethics and AI, most of those examples are not military funded, but actually corporate funded, Google funded, things like that. Are we seeing a shift now? Are we getting a lot more funding from outside the military, or is that just noise?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think didn't researchers at Google walk out because they were taking too much military money? So I think Google's taking some military money too. So,
got it.
Right? I think so. And again, this I only know what I read in the newspaper, right, or online. Yeah, but they have enough money. They have enough money. They may not have access to. And I wish Kathleen Vogel said she couldn't attend today because she's giving a talk at the same time. Whenever she would give a talk at Cornell, I said, okay, Kathleen, you don't have a security clearance, so how do you know? And I would ask myself the same thing. I don't have I used to have 50, 60 years ago, but I don't have one now. And so there may be a classified aspect of why Google takes that money. I don't know. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
But it is an interesting thing. The fact that it's one company.
Yeah. All right, we have Abhik is next. Oh, we don't have your sound yet. Uh-oh. Oh, that sounds
what
better.
about now?
We're good. Yep, we got it.
So, hi there. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm a PhD student. I'm looking into sensor fusion systems, but very excited about reducing suffering and the sort. And so from that front, I actually wanted to get your thoughts on wartime ethics. So there's a lot of examples of, people setting pigs on fire and setting them into the enemies, or people having suicide bomb dogs, or many other things for humans where wartime often justifies certain types of research or actions against sentient beings that are negative. And I was wondering what your thoughts were as these people were thinking about how to make artificial intelligence, what their thoughts were around the ethics of the agents that they were bringing into existence, as well as how that manifests today with some people's approach to building artificial brains, seeing that as a desirable thing, as well as taking approaches like spiking neural networks or trying to find the underlying fundamentals of how our brain operates and trying to just copy and paste them and see what happens without too much consideration, or any other potential risks of our current kind of militarized view on technological development and AI.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And I appreciate the fact that you went from military projects itself to these wider dreams that some people in AI have had over the years of what's the ethics of that, right? What's the ethics of that? Okay. Let me start with the wider view, with the ethics of doing this. So since I've been at Cornell, students will come in my class. These are students from computer science, information science, electrical engineering, and social scientists too, and historians. But when there was in the late 90s, this idea that you could get a chip and implant it in your brain to increase the capacity of your memory operations in the brain, your thinking itself. Kids were excited about. I don't know if Jamie was a TA then or kids were excited. They wanted to do that. They saw no problems with it. They saw no downsides with it. And I said, I didn't know how to respond to that. I go, really, you don't see any downside? No, I said, it would be great to have all this capacity, right? So I didn't really know how to handle all of that, right? I taught engineering ethics as well. In fact, Jamie was, when he was a PhD student, taught in that program too. And I would run into that. But the other point was about the, when we get to the stage where the supposed stage, I think it's the same guy proposing all this, where artificial intelligence is smarter than human intelligence. What is the ethics of that? So these are large ethical, that one is even larger. And that's kind of the one where you're getting at too, I think, when you say splicing, right? Spiking or spiking to that. Those are huge issues. So when I've taught those issues in engineering ethics, I draw on something that Deborah Johnson, who's a philosopher of moral philosophy and engineering ethics, and probably the first person or group of people to do any work at all in computer ethics. And her point was this: it shouldn't be the technology, the state of the technology, that determines how we think about the ethics of humans and technology. We should have ethical principles to talk about that. So that's the basic. So she did that with computers right away, because people would say, for example, computers, they have an objectivity to that. You see this today with the machine, and they have an objectivity today. So the artificial brain, though, seems to be at another level, right? Because that's getting at what it means to be human, right? And also spiking. I think by spikes in your brain, you're talking something similar, like the increase. Is that what you're talking about? That seems to, or is that something different?
It's a technique. It's there's the the Utah array, the spikes for the implants that they have.
Yeah.
But there's some researchers who are looking at, instead of the perceptron as a how to fundamentally architect these neural systems in a way that mimics action potentials and neurons.
So what do you do with your own brain to that?
And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, oh, using this new fundamental unit, let's implement the structures that we see in the brain using these units and train them on computers, on artificial systems, such that they can learn how to solve these systems in ways that groups of neurons would solve these systems.
Okay, so it's spiking AI rather than spiking your own brain.
Yeah. So it's a architecture, but the Fitbit for your brain excitement that is happening right now in neuroscience is also a whole nother dimension of ethically questionable, in a way, in the meritocracy we live in now, where if you can buy the implants, an also extremely important ethical question.
Sure. Okay, so you're talking about also about this. I didn't want to bring up the singularity because to me but that's just basically what you're getting to. Are you talking about things that may happen before there's a singularity? Because this is a way to increase the cognitive power of neural networks, right? Perceptrons.
It's a different architecture, it seems.
Sure, but that's the goal, right?
Yeah, the goal would eventually have it be able to scale to be a general problem solver of the sort. But the singularity means a lot of things. But I think that's one of the ones where it's like, oh hey, it's almost a reproductive ethics question though, where it's like, is the human brain really the best way to solve problems, or to exist in that way? Where it's like, we seem to have a lot of cognitive biases and we seem not to be great at a lot of things. But that's another interesting question, but feel free to answer any and all.
So the point about we seem to have a lot of biases and these systems wouldn't. I don't know if you've read Ruha Benjamin's work, that Race After Technology. So she addresses that directly. So there's this belief, right, that the right algorithm will be less discriminatory than humans. And her basic point is, but humans are designing this.
Yeah, and
right. That's her main point. The humans are designing it, right? So go ahead.
Oh, there is the fundamental data, and also a lot of the questions, like a lot of the bias questions,
Right.
are like fundamentally unanswerable. Where often we'll say, "Oh, we want fairness," but fairness leads to negative outcomes based on our predispositions, because we humans have an incorrect model of the world, and so definitely projecting that incorrect model onto computers will not solve anything.
So how would you get a correct model of the world?
Something that I'm excited about is learning from the data and saying a lot of philosophy has been on a self-report paradigm where it says, oh, we humans, we have these perspectives. We challenge these perspectives against our intuitions and against our information about the world. And I build like wearable systems and ubiquitous technology, person-centered data gathering systems to hopefully learn about human perceptions on a fundamental data basis, as opposed to like a self-report basis, where you might say, oh, I would act this way in this situation, but the data might bear out that, oh no, humans actually act this way.
So
and even though it's your perception.
So where does the data come from?
So I have all of the good sensors, cameras in the house, in-bed sensors, wearables.
So who's placing the sensors around the house?
It is currently a hand-engineered process, but
but I mean the placement itself. How do you decide where to put the sensors in the house and how many sensors to have? Who makes those decisions?
So there's the metric. So with like all machine learning stuff, and I think that you mentioned this with the Go program, where initially the person who was programming the machine had to play with an expert Go player to see where the limitations of their hand engineered features were. So they had to hand engineer certain parts of the architecture initially to be able to get it to perform well. But then as time went on, there's now AlphaGo and a few other advancements that have been able to learn the things that used to need to be hand engineered. And right now, these sensors are hand engineered, where it's saying, oh, I put one in my bathroom so that it can see me go into the toilet and get an idea of that, and one in my bedroom so it can see things that I think that are important. And it's another layer of bias that's introduced, but not one that isn't overcomable through learning to say, hey, if I had a more random approach, stochastic approach to data gathering, then maybe I could get information that wasn't available before. But at this stage in the research, we're not even close to being able to learn those abstractly.
So have you heard this phrase that the raw data is an oxymoron?
Oh, it's all features at the end of the day?
No, it's all who develops ways to collect the data and what data, where to place the sensors and so forth. So there's no raw data. There is no raw data. There can't be raw data. Even if you go out into the ocean, you go to a specific, like there's an example with the submarine, right? They went to a specific place because they were interested in where the submarines were, right? Right? So do you know this book by Paul Edwards called The Vast Machine? It's about climate change, and it's about the way they use data for climate change.
Ooh, that sounds super exciting.
Yeah, this is a really great book. It's called The Vast Machine.
The Vast Machine.
Yeah, he talks about data models. Wait a minute. The quote, let me get the quote.
Go for it.
Here's the book. Oops, wrong one.
That's Edward's previous book.
Plug.
Let me read a quote from this book. I think it gets exactly what we're doing there.
Zoom presentations are so cool because you have the ability to tap your library in real time.
Yes.
Okay.
I haven't dog-eared my books nearly well enough for that, though.
So here's the quote, and I think it applies to all of this about data. Okay. Without models, there are no data. In other words, someone has an idea in their head, a model of what to collect. And then that's what produces the data. Otherwise, we don't have any data. So he's saying what the book is about. He talks a lot about data friction. And over time with the climate modeling, they have to use data that's really, really old. And they have to try to, all these different sensors, and the sensors change over time because the conditions say, so how do they work all this out together to get that? And by that time, then I think it's a really good understanding. It's a good sociological way and historical way to understand this phrase. I like, maybe raw data as an oxymoron doesn't work, but no data without a model.
Yeah, and I'm good friends with a quantified self group, and we always run into this problem when we're trying to compare each other's data. Is that Fitbit and the Oura Ring and the Apple Watch and all of these sensors,
precisely,
they have different black boxes, and it's impossible because we don't know what abstractions they're making, and the numbers that are supposed to be exactly the same are different, but we don't have access to the feature extraction pipelines to actually understand exactly what it is.
So I highly recommend this.
And yeah, because that's a big part of centrifusion, how to bring them together.
Because he studies how people have worked with this issue over time. So he brings together both sociology and philosophy and history. So the program in science and technology studies and STS programs that Professor Wetmore and Professor Baldwin and that I teach in, that's what we do, right? We don't try to use one approach from engineering or from philosophy or from history or sociology, but try to bring it together. It's kind of what you've been talking about, I think.
No, it's work that is ongoing and to be done. Very sad that we're not there yet, but important. Dr. Michael mentioned that there was a Fitbit class action lawsuit about raw data and models because, we're just not there yet.
So models. So I've written a paper about models, and cybernetics is all about models. Those are all models. It's all about modeling. The whole project is a modeling project, right? Right, to model the human brain, to model all this, and the way they try to do it over time is remarkable. So I was at a conference in Germany, and there were historians, sociologists, and philosophers there, but there was also a modeler there, which was great. Someone who did modeling today, right? And he looked at, and I gave a talk about how they were doing it in the 50s, and he goes, "We don't do it like that anymore." And he went to the board. And he kind of drew this thing that was like birds flying, and then all of a sudden they were in one place, right? So, but it was a model. Someone had created that model. Now, if you're talking about machines creating their own models, are you talking about that too? I thought you heard me saying that. Yeah, so,
definitely.
So what I would recommend there, von Neumann, when he's talking about cellular automata in the 1950s, he's talking about machines that who reproduce themselves. This is a mathematical theory about machines reproducing themselves. Now, whether they're producing new models, I don't know if cellular automata goes into that, right? But people have considered that. Right?
Yeah, the von Neumann probes and the sort. And I was thinking about, I was excited and spooked by this trend of learning effective models that are not understandable, especially around like language modeling and like concept modeling, and saying, oh, from this corpus of text, we have seemed to extract certain features about the nature of language, but they can't be disentangled in an effective way. Where, yes, it seems to be able to do translation well, it seems to build effective internal abstract representations, of which can be mined for insights into the underlying system, but cannot be explicitly understood in a way that's important. And I find promise in that. I think a lot of the philosophy and like the very complex models like human perception and cognition are at that level of complexity. But the scary part is that, yes, maybe we can build effective understandings of or effective digital representations of these complex systems, but can we interact with them in a way that is genuine, responsible, or that we actually know what we're doing?
Yeah, so that reminds me, I just contributed a chapter to a handbook, a SAGE Sage is a publishing company. They produce these handbooks. It's a new field. It's called human-machine communication. And I wrote the chapter on cybernetics and information theory since it's underlies all this work that's going on now and analyze everything. So they are actually trying to, okay, these people are from either communication theory, philosophy, there's scientists and engineers trying to understand what it means to communicate, what there can be communication like that. If you read Norbert Wiener's Human Use of Human Beings, he talks about that too. He says, okay, maybe a machine has a different kind of grammar. Now he's talking about a machine that humans have built, right? I mean, machine is not building itself. This is not a cellular automaton who's building itself. Humans have built these machines, right? But he's talking about maybe this machine has a different kind of grammar that we don't know we built into it. So this handbook will be out pretty soon. It's a new field over in communication studies called human machine communication. And so they're looking at that issue you raise. Yeah, it's good. No, it's good.
The control problem in the sort where how do we express our values? Very complicated. So
I remember Professor Wetmore and I had a long talk about values one time. And my suggestion in all of this is to know where those values come from, right? Rather than just assume. This is what I learned. This is what I learned from Professor Wetmore when he was assumed. Not just assume, right, that there are some package over there that you can just pull over like a piece of software or something, right?
And hand off to someone. Yeah.
Yeah.
The languages are different. All right. Thank you so much.
Ron, we had one question in the chat that we hadn't had a chance to get to yet, and we got 2 minutes left.
I don't try to look at the chat.
Nope, I'm going to read it to you.
Okay, good.
So could you please tell us about Warren Weaver's influence in financing research from the Rockefeller Foundation?
Sure.
And that comes to us from Jose Vanderhorst, who proudly notes he is a PhD in information theory, 1972, Cornell University.
Oh, good. So Warren Weaver funded a lot of things. As head of the Rockefeller Foundation, even before that, during the World War II, he funded the work that Shannon and also Norbert Wiener did when he was part of the military division of fire control. But as head of the Rockefeller Foundation, he funded Wiener's work on cybernetics, the work with Rosenblatt and Wiener in Mexico. The book Cybernetics was written in the laboratory of Arturo Rosenblatt in Mexico. There was a 5-year grant. He funded all of that. In conjunction with Weaver was the head of the physical sciences division of the Rockefeller Foundation. Robert Morrison was head of the social science division, but he was also a neuroscientist. Okay, so he funded all of that. He also funded the Dartmouth conference on artificial intelligence. So I published a paper, and it's also part of a chapter in Cybernetics Moment. They didn't know whether to fund that conference or not. They didn't know what these folks were doing, and they were skeptical and about it. They thought these folks just wanted to have it fun in the summer and talking to each other, and they were a little skeptical about the whole thing. And but without that funding, that conference does not exist. And without that funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, travel to the Teddington conference does not happen. And I would also say without the military funding, there's no travel either, because a lot of the funding during the travel during the Cold War was paid for by the military. It would go on military transport. So Weaver is very important in that. He had his disputes. He had his disputes with Wiener, back and forth, back and forth. Weaver says, I read this article, the famous 1943 article we all cite about teleology. He said, I've read this article, the introduction to this article 3 times. I think I'm beginning to understand what it means. He believed in mechanical translation. He was a big proponent of mechanical translation. So all the mechanical translation work that was done at MIT and elsewhere, he wrote Wiener and Shannon and said, what do you think of this? Wiener says, it'll never work, which it didn't for a long, long time. And Shannon, who didn't know much about language, just said, oh yeah, you can do this. So yeah, Weaver is very, very important.
Well,
I don't know
Ron,
if that answered the question.
it is noon, and I'm glad that we mentioned that there are more than just corporations and governments funding this. So thank you for adding that, Jose. Thank you so much for joining us and being such a great part of this seminar series. And yeah, I hope I speak for everybody else. I really enjoyed that, and I'm glad you were able to come.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
And are you enjoying
Albert, good luck
retirement?
with your work.
Thank you.
Huh?
Are you enjoying retirement, Ron?
I've been cleaning up my office over in Rhodes. 30 years, more than 30, 45 years worth of paper.
I
Yeah,
think
I'm
I helped
enjoying
you
it.
move into that office.
You probably did.
Yeah.
Oh, remember those lantern slides?
Okay.
I
Yeah.
found a note from you explaining what these lantern slides for mechanical engineering were. Thank God, because I'm trying to give them away. So there was a note from you about that. No, I'm enjoying retirement. I've been doing some of this work.
Yeah.
Like this, and also I've been working with grad students,
Great.
which I like. I'm glad everything has worked out so well for you and for Katina.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.